Monzo has 3 awesome funds available on their app. But what are you actually invested in? What companies do you own a slice of? Well, in this video, we're going to answer those questions. And we're going to focus on the juicy stuff. We're going to focus on the shares, the equity portion of Monzo Funds. The reason for this is because equity makes up a portion of all Monzo Funds at varying percentages, whereas bonds only features in the careful and balanced funds. So by focusing on equity, it's relevant for anyone who's invested in Monzo Funds and also those thinking about investing in them. Plus, it's frankly more exciting to find out what companies you're invested in compared to what bonds you're invested in. But before we get into that, if you're new to the channel, I'm Alex, a management consultant by day, and on this channel we like to discuss all things personal finance with particular focus on how to grow your money. And for this video, let's get into it, and let's firstly recap the funds offered from Monzo and how they work. Monzo offers 3 BlackRock funds: the Careful Fund, the Balanced Fund, and the Adventurous Fund. And as we discussed in previous videos, each fund reflects a different risk level, with the Careful Fund offering the lowest risk level as it's mainly invested in bonds, with 80% of this fund invested in bonds, 20% in shares. The Adventurous Fund is on the other end of the risk scale as the most risky fund. Since it's only invested in shares, 100% of this fund is invested in shares. And the Balanced Fund is the middle risk fund as it has a combination of shares and bonds, with 66% of this fund invested in shares and 34% in bonds. All of this information on the shares and bonds breakdown is available on Monzo's app, but they don't really tell us much more. We can see the exposure split of funds across regions on Monzo's app, and we can see that the funds are mainly exposed to the US, but we can't see what the funds are actually invested in. And for this, we need to go onto BlackRock's website and look at the information provided by BlackRock. Here we can see what the funds are invested in terms of the top 10 holdings. For example, with the Adventurous Fund, we can see what makes up this Adventurous Fund in terms of the top 10 holdings. We can see the Adventurous Fund is invested in the iShares MSCI USA ESG Fund at 17.84%, and we can see it's also invested in these other funds. For example, it's invested in the iShares UK Equity ESG Fund at 7.57%. However, this information won't mean much to most of us, as it doesn't tell us what companies and specific shares we own. It only shows the high-level funds. The reason it only shows the high-level funds is because Monzo's funds don't invest direct into stocks. Instead, they're basically a fund of funds, in that each fund invests in other funds, and they each invest in around 30 other funds, mainly funds from iShares, which are an asset management company owned by BlackRock. So for these reasons, a breakdown of Monzo specific funds only shows other funds, and it doesn't show stocks. However, the good news is that there is a workaround for us to find out what companies are held in each of the Monzo funds. And the way to do this is by researching the funds which make up each of the Careful, Balanced and Adventurous funds, and then finding out what companies those funds are invested in. So the first step is taking a look at the holdings we see on screen, the funds which make up the Monzo funds themselves. And we can then select a fund to research further and deep dive. And let's take a look at the MSCI USA ESG Enhanced Fund, given this makes up the largest proportion of both the Adventurous and Balanced funds at over 17%, and also features in the Careful Fund. So let's deep dive into this specific fund, and we can use a market data tool such as this one from the Financial Times to do this analysis. All we need to do is type in the name of this fund, then we can head over to the Asset and Holdings tab, and here we can see a breakdown by sector and region. So we can see in the sector breakdown that this fund is mainly exposed to the tech sector, with over 33% of this fund exposed to tech companies. However, this isn't the data we've been searching for. The most interesting data is below this, and here we can see the top 10 holdings. So we can see the specific percentages of the top 10 holdings making up this fund. And we can see that this fund is invested in all the big tech companies, in Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, Nvidia, Alphabet and Tesla. So all of this means that anyone who owns Monzo Funds, invests in Monzo Funds, has a slice of all of these big companies, as the Monzo Funds themselves invest in another fund which invests in these companies. And we can even get really specific and work out what percentage these companies make up of our Monzo funds. So let's take Microsoft as an example and work out what percent Microsoft makes up of the Monzo fund I invest in. So what percent Microsoft makes up of the Adventurous fund? We can calculate this by taking the percentage figure Microsoft makes up of this specific fund, which is 6.74%, and then multiplying it by the amount this fund makes up of the overall Adventurous fund, which is 17.84%. So we simply multiply 6.74% by 17.84, and we get 1.20% as the output of this calculation. And this means that Microsoft makes up 1.2% of my portfolio. We can do the same calculation for Apple. Apple makes up 6.34% of this fund, so we simply multiply 6.34% by 17.84, and here we get 1.12%. So Apple makes up 1.12% of the fund I invest in the Adventurous fund. All of this means that for every £100 I put in my portfolio, over £1 goes into Apple and over £1 goes into Microsoft. This is quite neat as I'm investing in the biggest companies in the world just by putting money in my Monzo fund. And although this process is quite fiddly to work out what specific companies you own and what percentages you own of these companies, this process does allow us to see what we're actually invested in. And we can see here what the top 10 holdings of this fund make up of my overall Monzo Adventurous fund. And it's likely that my fund is invested even more in these companies than just these percentages, as there's other funds in the Adventurous fund which have exposure to the US. So because the Adventurous fund is also invested in other funds which are exposed to the US, these percentages are probably a lot lower than the reality. As much as I'd love to provide a complete breakdown of the specific percentages in the Monzo funds in this video, I won't, as would be here forever and it would take a huge amount of analysis. But I hope I've shown a process which you can use to explore what companies you're invested in. All you need to do is replicate this process by firstly looking at the funds your Monzo fund is invested in, which I'll put in the description below, and then typing the name of the fund in a tool such as the one I showed and looking at the holdings of that fund. Through this, you'll be able to then see exactly what you're invested in. But that's all for this video. If you'd like to see how you can set up your Monzo funds for success, I have a video around here. Thanks for watching.